everyone, and welcome back to the City COLT Joycast. I'm Xingyu.
And I'm Michelle. Thanks so much for joining us today.
We are glad you're here and hope this episode gives you something meaningful to think about.
Thanks for spending time with us today. Let's dive in.
Today's episode features Bethanie Sawyer, a Latin teacher at New Canaan High School in New Canaan, Connecticut. She shares her approach to teaching Latin through a story-based curriculum, with a focus on interpretive reading, context, and comprehension strategies that help students engage deeply with texts.
Hi, my name is Bethanie Sawyer, and I teach Latin at New Canaan High School in New Canaan, Connecticut. When people talk about the purpose of learning languages, usually it's to communicate with native speakers. Since we have no current native speakers of Latin, the way we can communicate with them, although we do practice speaking and writing and listening, the way we can communicate with native speakers is to learn to read the texts that they've left behind. And so in my 22 years of teaching Latin, I've taught Latin with a bunch of different methods. But the one that really I come back to and the one that makes the most sense to me is to teach it with a focus on interpretive reading ability. And in order to do that and to make it most engaging and be able to reach really a large audience and a wide range of student ability is to do that through reading stories. So in our curriculum, we have different units and different themes, and then we have stories that approach those themes. I have one course called Latin Mythology and Etymology, and that's really intended for students with no prior language study who may struggle with reading, with language, or thinking abstractly about language, or just are a little hesitant to really jump into an intense course. And this Latin Mythology and Etymology, we start learning Latin through reading myths. And it is very engaging because a lot of people enjoy mythology. Some students aren't familiar with it, but the stories are, they can seem kind of wacky to high school students, especially if they're not familiar with Greek mythology in the first place. But they do really engage students. And we use our vocab lists are the words that they need to know in order to read the story. When we do grammar, and I don't do discrete grammar in the myth class, but in my other classes, the grammar is grammar that students will encounter in the story. And so this really informs our class and the structure, and the language that we're learning is the language that we encounter. And I think it does make a big difference because students, having the context of the story really helps students engage with the material and absorb and really take ownership of the language that they're learning. They remember the vocabulary better because they can associate it with an event that happens in the story. This helps on their vocab quizzes and just retaining it in future stories as well. The way I present the stories, I try and make it more accessible. And this is something, I always give this tip, because if you're giving any text that has questions attached to it, I had an epiphany several years ago where I had students who I would give them a story, sometimes even a reading in English, like some cultural background knowledge with questions attached to it, so they could see the important information that I wanted them to get out of it. I gave them like a page of reading in English and questions, and I had like 4 out of 25 students complete it. This was the myth class, because it was like a wall of text, and a lot of them had trouble reading in English. And something that I did, and now I do with all of my classes, if I give any text, English or Latin, that has questions attached, it's going to be in a chart. So if we have a Latin story, we'll have, a paragraph or a couple of sentences of the story in one box in the chart. And then to the right, there's a question about something in that part of the story. And then the next part of the story in the next box in the chart, and then a question about it on the side. And it's such a small thing. It takes very little effort on your part, but the difference that it makes is enormous because it decreases the amount of text the student has to look through in order to find the information that you want them to know and to respond to. And it's just, that's just how I make everything. Everything's always a chart. And it really helps students to focus and to sort of get the information out of it that I'm looking for them to get. When I assess students on reading comprehension, this is something that anyone can do if you're doing reading comprehension, especially with a story. I think it's harder with a nonfiction piece of reading. In the past, traditionally, Latin has been assessed through translation. Okay, so you read something and then on a test, you're given a passage that you've seen and you have to write out a translation, a close translation of it. And that's something that has its place and it gives certain information. But I find a lot of the time, a translation and comprehension, the Venn diagram is not a circle. There's overlap, but they don't mean the same thing. And so, I'll ask students just basic comprehension questions on an assessment or on a homework or in class. But I'll also do something that promotes some higher order thinking and promotes a little bit different engagement with the text, such as, so basically different ways to create inferences. So a lot of times I'll create inferences. And then it's the job of the students to support those inferences or form an opinion about those inferences and then support that opinion with specific evidence from the text that they then explain. So there's like 3 that I do a lot. Support the statement, probable, possible, and who would say. Support the statement's the easiest. You have a statement in English or in Latin, depends on the class. And it's an inference made about the story. Students have to find a specific section of the text that would give evidence to support the truth of that statement. And then I've started recently to have them explain why that evidence supports the text. So it's not just a translation of the text, or why that evidence supports the statement. Not just a translation of the text, but to show that they understand that specific part of the Latin in the context of the larger story or the larger text and the context of the inference that I'm making. I do have them write the explanation in English, but that's because in my classes, we're not taking time to practice output writing at a level needed to make these explanations. That support statement, probable, possible, very similar. Inference about the story, but students have to decide if it's likely true, not likely true, or if there isn't, if the evidence is conflicting or there isn't enough clear evidence to support either one. And again, they're going to first make their decision, find evidence to support their opinion, and then explain that evidence. Who would say, this is great if you have a story with a lot of characters and not a lot of dialogue. You create quotes that a character could say, not that is in the story. And then students pick which character is most likely would say it, provide evidence from the text, explain the evidence. These are different ways, a couple different ways to get students thinking about text, reading text, answering questions about it, and using their minds sort of in different ways to interact with it, that are different from, at least in Latin, some of the more traditional ways people think of. And this can be done with any text in any language. So I hope you're able to try it out. Thank you.
Thanks to Bethany for this episode. Here are our 3 takeaways from her insights. Story-based curriculum enhances engagement and comprehension. Scaffolding texts improve student success. comprehension assessments can promote higher order thinking. That brings us to the end of today's episode of the COLT Joycast.
Thank you for listening and for spending time with us today.
We hope you're leaving with something useful or thought-provoking from today's conversation.
Until next time, take care of our world language learners. Bye-bye.